to the cloud. All right, we're recording. Cool. Welcome everybody to the last working group meeting of the year. For those in the US, hopefully you had a good Thanksgiving holiday. For everybody else, hopefully there's good winter holidays coming up later this month. We've got a pretty solid agenda today. Lots of good stuff to talk through. But first, as we always do, let's go around and introduce ourselves. That way everyone can put names to faces so that while we're in discussion, we know who everybody is. We'll go through in the order listed on the agenda. So if you want to refresh that just to make sure you have any last minute changes accounted for there. I'll start off. Hello everybody, my name is Lee. And we kick from there over to Victor if he's here.
Hello, I'm Victor and I'm representing Advinans and issue at the final end of the agenda.
Hello, this is Antoine Boyer. I work on AWS AppSync and I'm from Amazon and interested in all agent items.
Don't think Rohan is here. Trevor also not here.
I can jump in. It looks like my PR was accepted and then overwritten, but I'm here in Trevor's place from Apollo. I'm Hugh Wilson, a core dev with Apollo. Nice to see and talk to everybody.
Sorry about the mix-up. Go ahead and send a pull request with your name again, and I'll make sure it gets merged.
For sure. Thanks, Lee.
Yep.
I don't think Michael or Raffle are here yet. I hope they join later on. My name is Pascal. It's the first time I attend the meeting. I support Michael and Raffle with their project Chili Cream and like to stay updated with the spec. So I hope to get the information I need.
Hi everyone, I'm Benji. I work on the graphical team and also maintain the GraphQL projects.
Hi, my name is Ivan, and I work mostly on GraphQL.js and help with other projects. And I accidentally logged in on the GraphQL Foundation account, so I will disconnect and connect back under my personal one.
Hi everyone. Sorry, yeah, I'm Praveen. I work at Hasura GraphQL Engine. This is my first meeting. I'm just excited to just participate.
Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Alan. I'm representing IBM. I'm working on GraphQL management as well as a tool called Open API to GraphQL.
See, is Mike here?
Mike's not here yet.
All right. Well, I'm Steven and I work at Netflix.
Hey folks, I'm Vince. I work at New Relic and I'm a maintainer of the Absinthe Elixir GraphQL library. And this is Ada down here.
Hi, I'm Evan. I work at Shopify. I'm happy to see somebody else from Ottawa in this meeting finally. Hi, Hugh.
Hello, hello.
Hey, I'm Matt. I'm here as an individual contributor. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Greg. I work for Intuit. I contribute to GraphQL Java, develop the GraphQL registration at Intuit, and we are planning to open source our Intuit query plan.
All right. Did we catch everybody? Did we miss anyone? I think we got everybody. I see that there's already some action happening in the notes file, which is amazing. I assume that's mostly you, Alan, but is anybody else willing to jump in and help Alan throughout the day?
I forgot to put the pencil emoji, but I'm glad to help as well.
Awesome. Thank you as always, dude. All right, let's look over our agenda.
I'm not seeing a link to the notes, Doc. I'm already missing it.
Oh man, I think it got overwritten. I'm sorry about that. Let me put it back in. We had some issues with this earlier today.
Put a link in the chat, Zoom chat as well.
I'll do that. Oh, I see you just did that. Perfect. Thanks, Stephen. All right, let's look over our agenda today, make sure it's covering everything we want to talk about today. We will, in a minute, go over last meeting's agenda items. But then today we're going to talk about the custom scalar specifications, the input union RC progress, making root query type operations optional, and potentially crowdfunding graphical. Anything else that we want to talk about today? Cool. I'll take silence as confidence. Let's take a quick look at the previous meeting's action items and currently open items and see if there's anything here we need to address. Most of these, of course, are going to land on me, so I have to keep doing. Oh, I think the primary issue here that is still open on me is to go back through all previous meetings, many previous meetings, action items that are still open and translate them all to GitHub issues. So I'll actually do that today. I'm going to do that today. But otherwise, looking at these other previous action items, oh, I think the only other one that's still open is having a draft plan for freeze and release. The plan is still to manage that in January and call it the 2020 release. Let's look if there's any other issues. Most of these are about the website.
As a suggestion, maybe we can like delegate some stuff to other people, like involve like volunteers into some stuff, like actually like going through previous action items. It can be done by somebody else. Maybe somebody volunteer for that.
If anybody's interested in helping with that, that would be amazing.
Maybe adding like help wanted on action items would be a great idea, because I think like in long term we need to distribute a lot, especially like for things that like, you know, bureaucracy thing or maintaining processes.
I totally agree. Well, let me take this first stab of moving everything into action items. I will do that today. I'll do it right after our meeting, actually. And I'll go through as many as possible and mark them help wanted. But I really like that suggestion. All right, let's move on. Let's take on our first agenda item of the day, because I anticipate we'll spend a fair amount of time on it. Evan and Andy, I'll hand it over to you guys. Evan, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, excuse me, absolutely. So we have, sorry, tabs. Right, at the last meeting, we kind of talked through the basics of the custom scalar specification. Since then, Andy and I have put together a proper RFC, a proper PR to change the spec with all of the changes. And so there are just a few things left to talk about. The first thing that I wanted to ask about is the RFC currently proposes a new standard directive as part of the spec. And plausibly, like that is technically a breaking change if there are schemas that exist which already use that directive name for something else. So I wanted to kind of poll the group here to know if, well, A, are there any schemas in the wild that we know of that would be broken in this way? And then I guess also figure out a little bit, how do we want to handle this sort of thing going forward? Do we want to say that we can just add more directives to the spec at any time? Or do we need to have a bit more of a process around that? For context, in this case, the directive that we are adding is at specified by. So, thoughts?
So technically it's name at specify, right? And by is argument.
Yes,
so
sorry. Right.
It's nothing specified.
Yes, that's correct. My bad.
Maybe as I don't know if it's I'm reading the notes, but maybe it's been if it's been suggested already. Sorry about that, but maybe as we could put in spec that if any implementation or developer adds a directive that as a best practice, they should add like a namespace, like a prefix. That's what we do for the directives that we add on top. So there's no breaking change if the spec were to introduce new directives. I don't know. That's just an idea.
I like that. You're suggesting adding that as like a non-normative note directly into the spec.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. We talked about using double underscores the way we do with kind of built-in introspection fields, but that just felt kind of gross. Things that are not that unusual. But I do like the idea of asking third-party directives to be namespaced in some fashion. I don't think that makes sense to be built into this RFC because it's kind of a separate thing. But we can throw together a separate RFC after this one if somebody wants to do that. Or even, I don't know if that really requires an RFC, if it's just a non-normative note in the spec. Lee, I don't know, thoughts on that?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a formal RFC, I don't think. Especially if it's just sort of like we're searching the crowd here for some best practice wisdom and what we hope people will do with directives. I think just a pull request is probably fine. And, we'll still take our time with it and make sure that it's well written. And if there's any complaints that we factor those in, but I don't think we have to go through the full RFC process for it.
Cool. Antoine, is that something you want to tackle or is it your idea?
Yeah, I could add that, yeah. Trying to find a pen. Yeah, I'll take on that.
Cool. Well, that was an easy way to address that one issue. The only other thing I actually wanted to talk about, since we covered a lot of the more detailed stuff at the last meeting, was if people have had a chance to read through the RFC and read through the pull request on the spec changes, does everybody agree that we're ready to move to stage 2 and call this a draft RFC at this point?
Is there a link for do you have a pull request against the reference implementation?
No, I don't speak JavaScript, and so I'm going to have to ask for help from the community for that one.
It would be pretty simple. I can help you.
Yeah, that's my hope.
Yeah, hours. Yeah, so I just open an issue about that. So it's like right now I need to do release to not to bulk release of the spec. So it's not going to next release, but after that I can find.
Cool. That's the GraphQL JS repo?
Yeah, open issue there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think everything. One issue I want to raise, it's not like RFC itself, just examples on RFC. I'm kind of, so it's not to block stage 2, I'm like totally okay for stage 2, but in examples, I saw some discussion, I didn't have time to read for entire discussion, but it's like give links to RFC directly. So like RFC for URLs is pretty complex and RFC for datetime is pretty complex. So if we just referencing them, we still allow a lot of freedom of implementation. It's not like we narrowing down like URL and datetime from a string to something, but it's still like pretty big something. So as we discussed like previously with datetime, idea was to have a document saying some document between RFC and like saying we don't support like entire RFC, we support some subset of RFC, and I think something similar would make sense for URL and other complex RFCs. So I'm worried that inside the examples we're just referencing RFC directly instead of referencing intermediate documents.
Yeah, Andy and I talked about this a little bit. We don't want to block this part of the RFC on having all of these sub scalar specifications written up. So maybe we just need to find better examples than that where we can reference an existing RFC with an existing spec for a better example scalar without running into this issue in the short term. But I don't know what examples to use for that case, so suggestions are welcome. I'll do a little digging if not.
Maybe like base 64 if they have a spec, or UUID. I don't know how complex the specs, but for me it's pretty well-defined stuff. So like the only suggestion I have like, from reading current version is this one.
That's a great idea. Thank you, Ivan.
I just want to say I think your examples are reasonable, and I think it's totally reasonable to. I mean, we've talked about datetime on and off for a long time, but I actually really like pointing directly to an IETF RFC because it makes it clear that the spec doesn't have to be a custom thing and it doesn't have to be a GraphQL specific thing. So I really like that aspect of it. I hope we don't lose it. And I think especially the datetime one, the 3339 one, is actually pretty crisp, and I don't know that we would subset it much, if at all. And it's probably pretty rare that people subset that spec in their own code bases.
I can't speak too much for Andy because he's not here, but I'm pretty sure he'd disagree with you on that point.
Yeah, I'm sure he would.
He's got a draft of the datetime subset spec that he's working on that we can talk about at a future date.
Cool. But again, I mean, part of why I really like the scalar RFC is that it allows for this kind of disagreement.
Yep, absolutely.
Can I ask one question about like where this started and now where it is? It seems like this was initially suggested as like a URL like primitive type, but then it got morphed into like the @specified directive. And I wonder if it still solves the goals that were listed in the problem, just where like specifically the second bullet point talking about how like client tools will be able to introspect this. I wonder if by using like the by URL, if that's at all problematic, like if one person implements it with HTTP versus HTTPS in the URLs and how clients would be able to introspect that. I think it definitely helps a lot with like the documentation side of things. And if that's the current goal of this, I think that makes a lot of sense. But just wanted to make sure that since it did morph, that we're still solving the problem that it was initially trying to.
I think that it does. I think that that was only a syntactical shift that, but correct me if I'm wrong, Evan, but the introspection didn't change at all when you shifted from putting a URL directly in line versus changing to a directive. Is that right?
That's correct. I think I might have tweak the field name a little bit, but that's not a big deal. Yeah, as far as like the fluidity of the URL and in the directive, Matt, I mean, yes, but I don't think there's anything we can use to identify a specification that's any more precise than a URL at this point. I mean, hopefully people use HTTPS and don't tack on weird anchors and just kind of put a base URL in there, and then and even if they don't, then it won't work with the tools that assume that's the URL they're going to see, and so that's the problem.
I also think in practice, what is likely to happen with this is you'll have a handful of very popular tools that advocate for specific cases that they support. So for example, you could imagine that the Apollo client would say that if you say that you have a type called date or date time, or call it whatever you want, but as long as it says that it is specified by RFC 3339, then like magically it'll show up as date objects in your JavaScript code, then that will incentivize people to do that right. And if they put in HTTP instead of HTTPS, and all of a sudden that breaks, then they'll notice and they'll go fix it. So if clients all disagree on HTTP or HTTPS, then we've got a bigger problems on our hands, which hopefully that won't happen. But I expect that in practice, that's likely what will happen, is that we'll have sort of a pool of tooling that all sort of agrees on a handful of the most common ones. And then people will go in and customize from there with their own supported ones. That's kind of what I expect will probably happen. But the goal, the problem still remains the same, which is to allow for some unique identifier for tooling to associate with some behavior that they can apply, in addition to documentation.
I also want to ask, like, for confirmation, like last time we discussed this issue, we also, if I remember correctly, we agreed that GraphQL.js as a reference implementation also, for it also to make sense to contain some scholars like daytime and other. So like, what would be procedure for accepting like new scholars into reference implementation? Because it's actually like in some sense it's like approving a scholar, maybe not including it as spec, but at least approving for reference implementation.
That's a great question that I haven't thought too much about. I think I'd like to kind of handle that separately and just for now not accept any scalars into the GraphQL.js like that, and wait and see a little bit what comes out of the community, and like what, because there's also like what scalars does GraphQL support is also another way that we can kind of quasi-bless particular implementations, and I want to be careful with that because it opens a lot of the same cans of worms that we wanted to avoid by not putting them in the spec in the first place. So yeah. I don't know.
So if first like PR is for stage 2, PR would be just adding specified by itself without any scholars using it, right? So it's like it's.
Sorry, say that again.
So with PRs that we discussed previously for GraphQL for reference implementation, it should be just for adding specified by and introspection and all the mechanics, but without adding any scholars, right?
Absolutely.
I think that's right. Yeah. I think it would be reasonable in any documentation in GraphQL.js to mirror the same examples that are in the spec. So, if you say like, hey, if you want to use this, here's an example of how you could use it with a date, and then you can use the exact same example that's listed in the spec. I think that's reasonable. But I agree, we might want to just like wait a little bit with supplying an out of the box date type that already uses this, just to avoid the can of worms that Evan is talking about. But in order of how we get there, I think that's a good question. I think we want a warranted, like, dedicated discussion to that, especially since I know Andy cares a lot about this, and he hasn't been able to make the last couple of meetings. So we'd probably want to talk it through with him and figure out what we want to do there. But it is pretty clear that at some point we will have to come to some consensus on one that we want to start supporting and tooling. And it doesn't have to be the only one. Like, there could be 2 or 3 that we end up supporting for variants of date. But at some point we'll figure that out. But it doesn't have to. I don't think we would block this particular RFC advancing stages on that.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Are there any other questions or any other concerns? I will take silence as this is ready to go to stage 2.
I think having working changes in the reference implementation is criteria for stage 2. But beyond that, all looks good.
I'll file the ticket then, and we can move that along.
Cool. And we can advance to stage 2 outside of working group meetings, since that's the last remaining piece. And the reason that it's an important criteria is that it's always possible that you stumble on some implementation detail that ends up being weird, that reminds you of something that you didn't think about when you were just writing spec text. In this case, this RFC is simple enough that I think that's unlikely, but it's still probably a good idea to make sure that the RFC is in, or that the pull request to the reference implementation is in good shape first.
Yeah, of course. I think I just got confused about whether the implementation was a requirement of stage 2 or a requirement to start in stage 2, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I know
it's need to do it either way, so
a little confusing.
And just for clarity, for the reference implementation, there's really not a whole lot of work, because this is really just specifying a field that is going to be available for introspection.
That's the hope. Yeah.
Cool. Well, if you're not comfortable with JavaScript, I could probably help with that.
I mean, yeah, I'll file the ticket and I'll ping you and Ivan, and you can sort it out. I mean,
great. Awesome. Be happy to have your help, Matt.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns about this agenda? Cool. All right. Move on. Vince, I'll hand it to you.
Great. So I put a link to the Input Union doc in the chat, and it's in the notes. It's gotten a bunch of work in the last few weeks, lots of emojis, which have helped give it some structure. And we started doing evaluations of the various criterias and solutions. So there's a little like color-coded system for that. And you can see where we stand sort of with the various criterias and the various solutions. And I think our goal with that was basically like, let anything in and evaluate it, even if it may or may not become a requirement for the eventual solution. So some of these criteria kind of are mishmash. Some pass, all of them pass, some of them, most of them sort of don't pass. But I encourage folks to take a look through here and soak some of that in. I added 2 new criteria to try and push things a little further along. They both have to do with backwards compatibility. So it seems like there's kind of 2 spaces in which we haven't covered that may where problems might arise. If we make any changes to the SDL, we would want those changes to be backwards compatible with existing SDL parsing. So if there's like some funky new syntax and all of the existing tools start breaking, that's like a bad deal. And similarly, with any changes that might have to happen to the introspection result, we don't want that to, break existing tooling, especially graphical. So maybe it doesn't adopt the new capabilities until the code is updated to reflect that, but we wouldn't want existing stuff to straight up break. So those criteria have been added. They haven't been evaluated yet. I'm hoping folks can help kind of think that through. Hopefully we can simulate that without necessarily like doing full implementations of each of the solutions. So like maybe wire up a dummy introspection result and toss it into graphical. What this kind of pushes us to do is think a little bit more about, for the various solutions, what would the introspection and the SDL changes really look like? We have examples of kind of the SDL and kind of the query in the doc, but we haven't really started thinking about what that means for the introspection necessarily. So that's like an area where folks who want to help push this forward could start contributing. We might get a little more formal about what the changes to SDL and introspection might look like for the various solutions. So those are the, if folks get a chance to take a look at the doc now, there's been a good amount of work, and I'm hoping folks can help contribute. There's a little more evaluation needs to happen. And then we're kind of getting into the stage where we can really think more deeply about like which of these solutions are really on the table. So that's kind of the state of things. I guess I want to open it up with the hope that we can get action items and think about how we move it to the next stages, or to any stage, I guess, in the spec parlance.
This is awesome. This is a dramatic improvement over the last month. Especially the like crosswise evaluation makes it much, much easier to read.
Great. Yeah, I didn't do all the work by any stretch. There were a few other folks who helped contribute significantly.
Yeah, I agree. The ideas from previously to do like the lettered, numbered, criteria and solutions. This definitely shows that that's super useful for people getting up to speed with all these solutions that have a lot of nuance, and you really see that obviously when you look at the chart and see that there's trade-offs with all of them. One thing that's not immediately obvious to me when I look at the criteria is which ones are most important. I see there's some objections, but do we want to try to order them or rank them or something?
That sounds, yeah, I've had similar thoughts. And I was kind of at one point pushing to like remove some because I didn't think they were important, but I got pushed back on that. And I think using the results of the evaluation can help us inform which ones we put in kind of like a should or a must kind of category. I think that's a pretty tangible next step, is to get more clear on like, what are the musts and what things are sort of just like nice to have, kind of irrelevant. I'm very open to suggestions on how we get, and that's also the first place where we're reaching sort of decisions. Right now in the doc, like it's sort of like just put everything in there. So I'm looking for guidance on how to do that kind of evaluation, since it is like making decisions.
Yeah, I wonder if we could. I like Steven's idea of just like stack ranking them, ordering them, because then you could kind of see, especially when you look at the grid of results, if you see like a red X high in the list, that's worse than a red X low in the list. Of course, how we ever decide on what that stack ranking is could alone be like another total rat hole. So I don't want us to like burn time on that. But I wonder if there's something slightly more coarse that would be much easier to agree upon, that maybe to follow on your idea of the like shoulds or musts sort of thing, but changing the vernacular a little bit. Maybe if there's like a category of these that are just like broadly agreed upon, just like everyone agrees that like these are critical. Like if you didn't have these, like this wouldn't be worth doing. And then you could have just another set that are like controversial. And that way at least there's the coarse ones. And I don't know, hopefully you don't end up in the case where literally all of them end up in the controversial bucket. Then it would be a useless exercise. But it might give something to create the beginning of a stacked ordering. And that way people wouldn't nitpick too much about, you know, A being before B versus B being before A.
Right. So one thing I got on an emoji kick here, and there are gold, silver, and bronze medals that I could use to designate the, like, if we come up with 3 tiers and we just give those names, then we can, you know, at a glance see like, uh-oh, we've got like 2 gold criteria failing across the board.
Well, I like it. I don't know exactly what bronze, silver, and gold correspond to yet.
Yeah, we probably need like some more tangible words associated with those, but for the at a glance.
I love it.
If we wanted to get all mathematical with the evaluation, then from like a gold, silver, bronze, for example, we could, you can apply weights to the criteria and use something like a decision matrix is it's a concept that's used in some industries to make decisions like this. And basically you put all this in and you get a score for every potential solution.
It's not a bad idea. I can play with that to see if it gives us anything tangible or if it's just a mess of numbers. But yeah, that's interesting.
I personally think it should be like 2-stage. So right now we like brewing stage, we like adding everything to a spec and to RFC, and when it should be distilling stage. So we should like distill it down. So like maybe unify some criteria, or even like to find out some criteria is not really want. So, but like one thing I'm worried about is like currently it's like we don't need consensus on anything because we're just adding stuff. So I can allow myself to miss some RFC because I know like nobody like more or less removing anything, people just adding stuff for later phases, for later discussion. If we start ranking stuff, we kind of need consensus, which slows down things. So I would suggest like finishing adding like everything, and when switching to like distilling mode and discussing criteria, but to make it like separate stages, because like for second stage we need consensus. If we decide to exclude some criteria, we need like consensus that everybody okay excluding it, or if we agree on some criteria is must. It's like we need to wait some time for everybody's like have their objections.
I agree. I think what we should, I like the gold, silver, bronze thing. I think I'm totally comfortable with that being Vince's opinion at this point, just in the matter of adding some clarity and being add only and moving quickly. We can consider that part of the same phase of information gathering. If there's really contention over whether something has been marked silver but should have been bronze, we'll deal with that later. But like, again, I think as Vince already pointed out in this document, particular passing and failing is not the final word here. This is just purely information gathering and trying to help us lead towards making some kind of decision. And even, you know, I like the idea of like a decision matrix weighted score. It doesn't mean that we'll use that to decide on what we're going to do. But it is helpful to like look at this, you know, 5 by n grid and be like, okay, how does it add up? And if there's some quality of the score, then you can at least look at that and disregard it or treat it with some amount of weight.
Yeah, I'm happy to run with it and just sort of go with my gut and give these gold, silver, bronze, and then let people have at it. And, you know, if people strongly disagree with something I said, like that's a signal that we need to pay more attention to that particular one and revisit it.
Totally.
We also need to evaluate some of the standard solution criteria as well, like the backwards compatibility, performance as a feature, and the rest. And I think some of those, particularly things like performance as a feature, are kind of hard to evaluate at this stage. They're really important, but without implementations, we can't measure them, and it's just sort of opinion, really, or guesswork. Does anyone have any thoughts on how best to approach that problem for the existing standard spec change solution criteria?
I think there's two problems there. One is about document clarity. So Vince helpfully listed out the guiding principles. That's what you're referring to here, right?
Yep.
Then there's the solution criteria that are all lettered. So maybe what would be interesting is listing the specific letters that apply to that guiding principle. You know what I mean? After that guiding principle. So performance as a feature is a guiding principle, but then there is actually one down in here somewhere, L, input union should be performant for servers. So you could see that L comes after that one, and then that would make it clear that we do actually have a solution criteria that has been guided by that guiding principle. So that's one, is just making sure we have good coverage over the guiding principles.
That's a good idea.
And then the second one, I think more tactically, what you're asking about is how, like for performance, how would we even know without building something? Certainly we can do some like back of the napkin sort of analysis, like understanding if something is a O of 1 problem versus O of n problem is already somewhat helpful, but then knowing if that's a meaningful difference versus a not meaningful difference is tricky. So if we want to get real with it, and we probably can, especially if we're going to land on something like that as being important, we could build, you know, like demo runs, essentially write the smallest bit of code that, whether that's like a pull request against an existing GraphQL implementation or something relatively similar enough, and then put extreme cases into it and then measure them. So that we know that like O of n, oh yeah, this one's O of n. However, the largest like reasonable one is, you know, input union with 300 or 1,000 different features, and then it takes, you know, if it takes 100 milliseconds to run, that's probably bad. If it takes 1/10 of a millisecond to run, that's probably fine. And so we can actually just write a bit of code to try that out. Well, it's not perfect, you know, but it might at least give us some order of magnitude to understand where things might lie.
Yeah, that seems reasonable for down the road. And for an example of my gut read, like I would rank the performance criteria probably as a bronze, because none of these solutions present any like computational complexity, like compared to the types of operations that another API is already doing, like talking to a database or something. These criteria are like probably not measurable.
Potentially the structural discrimination one could get computationally expensive for very like esoteric schemas.
The which one?
Structural, what's it called? Structural discrimination. Yeah. I mean, it's probably, in reality, it's probably, as you're probably right, it's not an issue at all. But it's like, hypothetically, you could probably design an esoteric schema that made structural discrimination very expensive.
And this is a great example of the conversation we want to have after I shoot from the hip.
Yeah, totally. That's why I think you're both right. Vince, you're totally right to point out that it's not the, like, there are more important things to consider here than computational complexity, because realistically, it's not the one that we're most concerned about, except in edge cases. Totally valid. And if there's cases where that's the case where you might see like a green check with a yellow warning sign or something like that. If there's like, hey, this particular solution is susceptible to an attack vector, where if your schema is in a particularly weird shape, someone could send something to you that throws you into a n factorial, you know, or if you implement this poorly, you could end up with extremely bad performance. Here's a note for implementers if this ends up being the path that we take. So that kind of information is incredibly valuable. So we should still continue to collect that. And it could, I mean, you might be right. It could be that one of these actually has a particularly terrible performance hit in some odd or extreme case that we'd want to know about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, the thing I want to say is that if all of the solutions have no performance hit, that's great. They can all pass that criteria. But that is not the same as that criteria not being important.
Totally. Agreed. One nuance I do want to add to that is I want to make sure that we're zoomed in on the appropriate resolution of what that criteria means. More specifically, what I mean is, because we're looking at this as, you know, even in the worst case, these are probably going to have fairly acceptable performance, which means that they shouldn't all get green checks except ones like maybe yellow. You know, actually maybe they should, but anyway, we should be able to see which one of these is guaranteed to have the best performance, which one's likely to have the worst, and then understand exactly what that means. I think the reason why we're highlighting it as bronze is that we expect, or the reason why Vince had suggested highlighting it as bronze is because we expect all of them to have fairly decent performance. And what you're saying is totally true, which is like performance is super important. That's why it's guiding principle. Shouldn't it? Maybe we should articulate that as being gold because it's really important. But then if it is, then we would have to sort of understand that all of these are probably well within the realm of reasonable when it comes to performance. So there's a little bit of nuance there, but I think we're probably already spending too much time talking about it, considering that all of these are likely to be reasonable and we don't have any data yet. But I think we should be gathering that data.
So it looks like where we stand is some next steps include getting the sort of gold, silver, bronze labels on all of these, and that incorporated, link the guiding principles to the various criteria that are relevant to them. That's some good stuff to do. And then it seems like we talked about this sort of decision mode we enter into after that all is done. Oh, also include getting all the criteria evaluated. They're not all done yet. Could we spend a few minutes talking about what the shape of a decision mode might be once we get there?
Yeah, I have a couple ideas on how that might look.
Great.
So one is, so we could either try to decide which of the various proposed solutions is best, and in one fell swoop narrow it down to a best one, and then continue with that as an RFC. Okay. An alternative path, because I imagine that might be tricky, is to do a weakest link sort of situation and figure out which among the various solutions is weakest and narrow them down sort of one at a time until we're left with one, or maybe some combination of the two.
Vote people off the island?
Exactly. And looking at the solution criteria now, I imagine both are going to be relatively tricky because there's fairly even coverage just with like different caveats. But I mean, we knew that going in. That was kind of the whole point of getting really detailed with our analysis. That if we can't agree on which one is the best, hopefully we can agree on which one is the least best, and then narrow that one out, and then sort of iterate onwards from there.
Yeah, I think the gold, silver, bronze will help because some of these, you know, just aren't going to be that meaningful. Or some of them are going to be super critical and like an obvious one fails it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, so that's cool. We have a sort of sense of, I think, yeah, cutting the weak ones is going to be the least controversial if they're clear. And going to be a good step, even if we then you know maybe we have 3 and then we have to decide between them. We don't go all the way with the weakest link style, but
yeah. Another thing that I might propose, and this might be a little bit tricky, but presuming that the whole purpose of this is to result in an RFC that will be firmly championed, it might make sense for the possible solutions to list champions, plural. Mm-hmm. So if there's a set of people who feel strongly, and someone could be a champion for multiple, right? If their mind isn't made up, but they're like, I would be really happy to champion one of these, and then they kind of list those, then that is also helpful in that it gives us a sense of support from a maintainer audience and from a like, if we end up voting this one's the best, but then we find out that it was only the best via attrition and nobody actually cared enough about it to champion it, then like that would also be a really sad outcome. I don't think that's going to happen, but then it also makes it clear. It's like, how do we decide that one gets cut? And I think the answer to that has to be that the person who is championing that one sort of agrees. They're like, they want to take their name out of the hat and say, I no longer want to champion this one because I'm convinced that it's the weakest link. And once something drops to 0 champions, then it's like very clear that we remove it out of the possible solutions.
That's really nice. I like that.
Part of what makes that tricky, the reason why I was a little bit hesitant, is it's really easy when you start putting names to things that it becomes about like which person is best, and as opposed to which idea is best. And it's really easy to like let our own emotions get tangled up into things, and that's human nature, and that's pretty tricky. And it's part of the reason why we have purposefully left champion names out of the possible solution so far, so we can let ideas sort of prove on their own merit rather than being attached to a particular name. So I think we'll just have to be cognizant of that. And when you put your name on something as a champion, it means not this is my idea, and if it gets voted out, I'm going to be pissed off. But this is an idea that if it succeeds, I would be happy to champion. And I take accountability and responsibility for helping aid the decision of whether this particular path gets trimmed from the tree, which is tricky, but hopefully that we can make that work.
I have like another suggestion. I think we too focus on solutions, propose solution, not on the problems. Maybe we can do opposite thing. Maybe find for use case people who can like evaluate, like, because we started solution criteria are good, and like we cannot like break stuff or make or add something that prevents schema evolution, but at the same time it should solve like real issues. And maybe we should have like a person, like if some company, for example, have a real use case for input unions, and I think like input from this company, from this person would be valuable, because he can evaluate like different solution against a real life use case and see how certain solution fits certain use case.
I tend to think that's kind of just implicit in being a champion for a solution. Like, that's why I'm here. I have use cases for APIs I want to build at my company, and that's why I'm championing this.
Yeah, but
Maybe
like we have like 6 or 7 different 7 different use cases. Maybe it's actually like we should emphasize it more. At least ensure that all the proposed solutions are actually solving all use cases. Not because like I'm not sure this is the case, and like have example of how they solve it.
So I kind of get the feeling that this is pushing us pretty far back in the discussion. Like we covered this long time ago. Like use cases are, I feel like we were pretty well agreed that there's pretty universal like set of use cases that are pretty legitimate that are looking for this solution. So I don't really want to backtrack into that can of worms of being like, oh, are there even use cases for this?
Like I agree with the list. I just saying like we have fixed one. It's already in document. I just saying like maybe we should like have evaluation of solution against these use cases. So like if we have abstract syntax tree, maybe one of the things would be to write how abstract syntax tree will look like with every solution. And if we will have champion for every solution, it can be like we can create a folder for every solution and can have like examples of how certain use cases solved by certain solution.
I see. You just want to see tactically what examples look like for a broader set of the use cases.
Yeah, because like, for example, we can have solution criteria. For me, like it's very important criteria is developer experience, but it's hard to quantify. That's why I don't add in it as solution criteria. So like experience of a person who writing a query. I think we have it inside GraphQL spec and guiding principles. There is one saying like GraphQL is driven by front-end engineers and the experience of writing queries. But if we just put it in solution criteria, it's not like binary. It's not like something is fitting or not. Like actually, like would be interesting to see how like a real life example would look like, or like adding features or describing IST. Is IST would be like readable or not? Like things like that.
But that's not a bad idea, or to just try out if a solution really feels good. Or
yeah, there is some important stuff here. I think one is making sure that because Yvonne, you're totally right that that's like the top principle is that we are doing things to make clients' lives easier more so than making servers' lives easier. We should make sure that developer experience is clearly very good. So making sure that maybe that factors into Vince as you're sort of figuring out your opinions on what's gold, silver, bronze. Things that affect developer experience should be given a strong amount of weight. Yeah. And then I like the idea of listing out more examples. Perhaps instead of ending up with like yet another grid of like every possible use case and examples, because that might end up just getting kind of repetitive. Yep. But there are examples listed in each of the possible solutions, which is great. But maybe what might help is if there's a case with the best developer, like what are the bounds of the developer experience for that? What's the best developer experience look like for that possible solution, and what's kind of the worst? And it's mired in opinion, but it at least allows us to go through and sort of write out the nicest looking example and kind of the ugliest looking example as the two extremes for each solution. That hopefully will result in less just like explosion of the document, and hopefully get to what you're suggesting, Yvonne.
Are we basically saying like, let's add developer experience as a criteria?
We could, I mean, I think the reason why Yvonne was also kind of waffling at making that suggestion explicit is that it's really unclear how you would evaluate that. And what's more helpful is breaking that down into what exactly it means in context of this particular proposal. So for example, there's a couple in here, like member types being able to be leaf types. You can fix that by wrapping a leaf type in an object, right? There's a lot of these that are more about developer experience and convenience than they are about expressiveness or allowing you to do something new, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're not important. It just means that they represent the developer experience. And maybe this gets back to this suggestion we were talking about earlier about tying the solution criteria back to guiding principles. So you're saying like this solution criteria is important because it's driven by these guiding principles.
Yeah.
Because we have at least two in there that are related to developer experience. One about simplicity and consistency over terseness and expressiveness, or over expressiveness, and another one about understandability being just as important. So those are two. But maybe it could even be important to just like list out yet another one. I think maybe it's even worthwhile to go back to this guiding principles document and making it even more clear, because we kind of like open GraphQL as like, this is the reason why this thing exists, and then we have guiding principles on top of that. But I think kind of points out a missing piece of that guiding principles list.
So it sounds like we have a variety of action items. I have what the ask I would have of anyone who wants to help here is to help complete the evaluation. There's a few criteria that haven't been evaluated yet. And then there's the two that I added about backwards compatibility with SDL and introspection that need a little thinking. So that's the place where I think the most help could be provided. One other thought I wanted to bring up is there's one solution that is directive based, the sort of one of tagged unions thing. And I kind of wonder if that has value on its own aside from this. Like I could see a world where there's the input union, but also this directive provides value as well in other situations. So I was curious what people thought of that.
Do you mean the one field directive, or?
Yeah, one of one field, correct.
Do you mean that it could be the case that more than one of these solutions ends up being the right one and we have multiple paths?
Not of the other ones, but the one of one field directive and something else. Because it doesn't actually, it's not really polymorphic input type, it's because it's a wrapper, but it does give, it's like this extra client side validation, which I could imagine being valuable in a variety of situations where you wouldn't necessarily use an input union anyway.
It's possible.
I mean, that's is actually just formalizing the tagged union, so it is not breaking. It's just adding the client validation. No?
Yeah. Right.
Yep, I see it as a totally possible path. It is a little bit weird in that, we usually suggest that there should be one right way to do things. That's not always true. Sometimes there's more than one way that you can do something.
If I can speak on this for a moment, I think one of the other uses of one-of potentially, and I've not extended the spec to cover this or anything like that, would be actually for input arguments as well. So at the moment, we're in the situation where input objects and arguments are very, very similar, but they are different. And there are cases where a field may want to accept exactly one argument. For example, if it's a finder, you might want to find a user by their username or by their email address or by their globally unique identifier. And these are three valid ways of finding the same user. At the moment, we express that with three separate fields, but doing it with one field and a one-of could well, or a one field or whatever, could be a valid way of doing that. There's also, I've seen interest in people who would like to see it supported on the output as well. It's kind of simpler to implement than unions and interfaces from a back-end perspective. Personally, I've tried to discourage people from that way of thinking because obviously interfaces in particular have a lot of benefits on that front, particularly when it comes to things like supporting objects that aren't explicitly supported with a particular fragment. So having a fallback effectively. But it is something that there has been interest in.
Cool. Yeah, the output ramifications are a little more tricky, but yeah, you're right to point out that input objects and arguments are intentionally quite similar. So it makes sense that that use case would also appear.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to bring it up because it had been on my mind that might be kind of useful in and of itself aside from this thread. But I think it feels like we've covered a lot, and I have some action items for myself, and I'll repeat the ask of folks to help complete the evaluations of the ones that aren't done yet.
Yeah, this is great. Again, thank you for pushing this. This is a dramatically useful document that's improved considerably in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to everyone else who's helping.
Any other thoughts on input unions before we move on?
See, we don't have any specific action items called out here. Are there any specifics that we want to call out?
For the notes, Vince is going to do the bronze, silver, gold. And we're going to tie the guiding principles to solution criteria.
And we want to complete the evaluations.
And complete the evaluations.
And champion for proposals for solutions. Is it, we agree on that, or is it under discussion?
Say that again.
Yeah, that's a worthwhile one. For folks who want to champion to offer themselves up on particular solutions.
Yep, I think that's reasonable.
And one, it's not discussion, just shout out for people to think. In prior art, I think there is like Swift and Rust, and they have ideas that you try enums is not like just an enumerator of something. You can tie like types to enums.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know you can kill, but like I really like idea. It's like similar to what Benji's suggestion, but as a part of a language. I'm like thinking about this for a month, but I don't have anything concrete. So like just idea for people to study prior art section and to brainstorm. I think like there is still possibility to find some hybrid solution or new solutions. So maybe we can add something that satisfy more criteria.
I have also an observation. the unions and interfaces are quite similar in that sense that they all assume the choices in the concrete implementations or components in case of unions. The only difference is that in union, the number of choices is well known and unlimited. In case of interfaces, it is open-ended. But in general, the behavior, or at least in GraphQL, from GraphQL perspective, is very similar. In order to, let's say, render or output the value of union or value of interface, you have to provide a fragment. Then look at the input part. On the input part, if I have the similar construct, like what been discussed with one of, for let's say, a field assume only one of multiple choices, or maybe a field can be a polymorphic type of, let's say, a type of interface. If, let's say, we don't, I know that we don't have the input interfaces, but think in the future maybe, and we have some use cases, maybe we will bring them up later. But in that case, how do I, as a user, as a client, how do I specify a value on input of the type that is that belongs to that set, not let's say the type of that implements an interface or a type that is component of the union. In my mind, those cases are quite similar. I'm not saying that we need to do the input interfaces right now, but when we work on the unions, I would suggest that we keep that in mind, because in the future that might come up as a valid case.
So there was a thread of on one of the previous issues that proposed this, and we did some thinking about it, and I believe the resulting idea was that they're effectively equivalent when it comes to what data you would be sending in. Whether it's a union or an interface is irrelevant, because they're like, one's a subset of the other.
Yep.
Conceptually. So there wouldn't actually be a tangible difference as to how you interacted with the API, whether it was a union or interface. And the interface, like the fact that interfaces have shared fields kind of doesn't matter, because you're publishing all the fields explicitly, you're not asking for them.
Yeah.
So that's why we went down the route of just sticking with input union, because you can't tell the difference.
Sure, we don't have the spec for the interfaces, but again, even if with the unions, just try to expand it for the interfaces. Even with the union, in order to be able to provide a value for a particular type, for a particular variant of that union, I need to tell what kind of variant it is, right?
Yeah.
The same is similar with interface. If, let's say, I assume that I have the input interface, I need to provide a concrete value for that interface interface definition. How do I specify the type?
Yeah, that's a lot of the content of the document and the various solutions is determining how we transmit that, and then we call it, how do we give it the type discrimination. So there's a variety of proposals in there that deal with that very topic.
Yep.
Cool. Sounds like we have good action items to take from there.
Mm-hmm.
I want to move on. Let's move on to Victor's root query operation types being optional.
All right. Hello. Thanks. So I was in the October working group meeting where I talked about an initial proposal to allow empty composite types in general, and I got some valuable feedback. And basically what I got from that meant that I think the only thing which can be sort of immediately solved was to maybe make the root query type optional. There are, I still think there is some interesting use cases for empty types in general, and one person made some quite they were quite engaged, I think, in that issue, but I'm not anymore. So staying on topic here, I think there is a decent argument to make basically subscription and or mutation only schemas supported in GraphQL. Especially, I think that's relevant if you're designing something using microservices, where you in the end basically composite a bunch of things together. And I think really what makes the query type special is really the fact that it supports the introspection. So in the my initial PR 631 to the spec, I proposed to not make the introspections reliant on that, but then I got some feedback on that, and now I think basically the proposal as it stands would effectively create a kind of stub query type on all schemas if you don't define one of your own, which only supports introspection. But other than that, you don't have to add dummy fields like hello world, test, or just underscore, all of which I have had to do myself at various points in time. So that's basically where I'm at with all of that. I don't know. I feel it's a good and decent proposal, and I'm interested in knowing if we think we can move this ahead to the next stage. I have not yet written any implementation or PR for GraphQL JS. I could do that. I think it would basically require some logic to make sure that this stub item exists and that it also doesn't try to validate that it has any fields, because it's just going to have this sort of implicit schema and types fields. Yes.
The problem seems relevant to me. I'm glad you've been searching for what a solution might look like. I do think the devil's in the details. Writing a change to the spec text itself might make it clear how complicated this will end up being.
And just for what it's worth, so we in Hot Chocolate, we allow that already today to do that. And so basically, if there is no query type specified, we basically specify a query type automatically that just has the introspection field. And we do that for schema stitching scenarios, where you have basically, you're building just parts of your schemas in, like domain services. And there are cases where you just have mutations maybe on one. So we support that, and it's, I think there is, it's quite easy to, should quite easy be to implement. So.
That's the variant where we allow the type to be empty.
Yes, it's no, it's not the type to be empty. It's like basically allowing to omit the query type. So basically, in Hot Chocolate, we allow just to specify a mutation type, and then we, under the reps, basically generate a query type that just has the introspection fields, so that we have again a valid schema. I think that could be done in most implementations now without any issues.
The main hesitation that I have with that particular solution is that it means that if you're doing the query for them, you're also giving the query object a name. And in future, you may want to specify a custom name. So personally, I'd allow them to specify their own name for that empty query type. But other than that, I think it's a solid way of going forwards.
Yeah, but that's just the nuances how you want to do it. But you're right. Basically, if you don't specify it, we'll take will use query just as a name, but we specifying it for them. And you're right, that could annoy them at one point in the future. Yeah. But I mean, in the schema stitching scenario that we have in mind, it's actually basically if there is no real query type on this domain service, we are not really stitching it in. And you can actually rename the actual query type at the gateway level. So it depends on your solution or on your problem.
Is that currently a valid introspection result, or if you tried to print an SDL?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I get where you're heading to. So basically, when we generate an SDL from it, we omit then the query type because it doesn't have anything in it. But that's a one thing where you could say some tooling might have an issue with. But we haven't noticed any tooling having an issue with this. GraphQL is working fine with it.
I see. Okay, so the suggestion then is that there's the introspection. The introspection shows that there is a query type, but only in order to expose the introspection fields. But then the SDL would not print the query.
Yeah, actually, that's how we have implemented it, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable implementation. It is a little bit confused, right? Because like, is there a query type or is there not a query type? There kind of is, but there kind of isn't. That doesn't feel great. I understand that it works, but it's a little bit strange, right?
I think confusion is inside the spec already, because introspection fields are tied, as far as I understand, both implementation spec. Introspection field at the moment they're tied not to a type, but to a start of a query. So, for example, if I remember correctly, in Relay Classic, you needed to reference a query type from a query, and you could not ask for introspection fields like on a second level, even if it's the same query type. So I think there is like confusion is already present in the spec, because like introspection fields are not fields inside the type, they're fields that you can apply on a query. So yeah,
exactly. We viewed it like that because the introspection fields on the query type, you wouldn't print that as well in the SDL. So when you're not printing those, there's no worse than printing an empty query type. And I mean, the introspection fields itself are kind of magically just in your query type. So that's why we went down that road to allow that.
So like they're not magically into query type, they're magically into you're able to query them magically. But if you create like inside your query type, if you create like another query field that reference the same type, so you
we actually
query introspection.
Yeah, Ivan, we actually put them really into the query type in our implementation, because this way we don't have to specify an extra code path in our execution engine that works differently just because somebody is asking for those internal fields. But we have kind of modifiers in our fields, like these fields are internal, so the user can't really access them. It's kind of like with C# classes where you have public properties and internal properties. And basically these are internal fields to us internally. So, but they are on the query type.
And this is interesting. I don't know if your solution, Michael, is generalizable because of that detail of how you're building that. The spec says that those are meta fields that shouldn't be on that type. So either we would have to have no type, but you can still technically write a query. However, that query must only include meta fields. But that might be tricky for some tools. Or we allow empty types.
Yeah, the question for me from an implementation perspective, I mean, from the user perspective who does some internal introspection on our types, basically gets a types object, cannot access these types. But from an execution engine perspective, it's we don't have to write extra code that says, okay, if that field is actually there, then if that field is queried, then it's actually not there. So we have to automatically do something. Lets me just write cleaner code in the execution engine. So that's a kind of implementation detail in the end from the spec perspective, like you don't have it there.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Victor, what do you make of all of this?
Well, to be honest, I think it's a. I mean, given the fact, because you can't see these fields if you do the introspection, and they wouldn't be printed if you were to print an STL of the schema, right? They would, but then you either have to basically hide the type or you have to be fine with being empty. And so I think like automatically creating a type, I mean, I guess it's fine, but it's a little bit strange because like, okay, yeah, sure, no one names their type query, I hope, because yeah, but so maybe, you know, I might actually go, you know, hearing this, I might actually say that, I mean, for all intents and purposes, like this is saying, if you don't define this root query type, you're going to get one anyway, but it's not really there. It's just sort of there for various reasons. So maybe I'm a little bit jumbled just now, but I'm thinking that maybe actually it would be better to, well, I still think there are different use cases for empty types in general. But maybe restricting it specifically to the empty root query type would be more conservative without sort of introducing spooky types, if you will, spontaneously. I mean, there are a number of issues with allowing them in general, but maybe that was actually mostly to do with interfaces more than just object types. I don't know. I think that's where my thoughts are at right now.
I wonder, would that make sense to provide the built-in empty query mutation and subscription types, just like we provide the built-in scalar types like int, float, string, etc. And then it would help not to avoid specifying a type, query type or mutation type if you don't have to extend it. If you need to specify it, you can always use the extension mechanism in SDL rather than definition. And it also might clear the confusion around what type should I provide for my query, or it's already built in and you just need to, would it make sense?
I don't know, that might break all existing SDLs that already define these.
I understand. Yeah, maybe we can work on the, and this is an ad hoc suggestion. Maybe we can work on the backwards compatibility, but I'm just throwing this idea out. Maybe that would help to solve this use case and maybe some others in the future.
Seems worth thinking about.
Yeah. No, sorry for interrupting.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking that, I mean, the SDL already supports empty types, right? So that's not really strange. So maybe that is like just allow, I think just raising that restriction for the root query operation type specifically, if in case we don't want to do it in general, would actually be a pragmatic way forward. I don't know.
I mean, it's allowed syntactically, but actually it's not allowed to be empty. Like even you can write in empty types, but they then have to be extended with fields. So it's just when you cut your schema in multiple parts, then you have to write this extension type. But I mean the query type is really special, or the queries that you can do on the query type is special because you can ask for those metadata fields.
Right.
I don't know.
So I think there's two paths forward here, and they have somewhat different implications, and they solve slightly different problems. So I think it's worth being concrete about what problems we actually want to solve. One path is to revisit the RFC that you closed earlier of supporting empty types, and really doing that across the board. So changing the grammar to allow empty selections, allowing empty objects anywhere in the tree, going full force with that. There's some motivation that explains why that might be useful, and evaluate whether that's reasonable or not. That's one path. That would allow us to get to a point where you could have a query type that's empty. Another path, which I think might get closer to the specific problem that you're trying to solve, is not allowing there to not be a query type at all. So there's no query type. And similar to how no subscription type implies that this server does not support subscriptions, and no mutation type implies this server does not support mutation, no query type would imply this server does not support queries, which might be strange, but sometimes that's the case in the scenario that you're talking about of these like micro GraphQL endpoints. In that case, I think what we need is language in the spec and some noodling around in one of the reference implementations to make sure this is reasonable, to see what would it look like to write a query of meta fields, so asking for introspection, when there's not a query type. Right now, that's probably a little bit confused, but that seems like a viable path to try out. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think that's a reasonable analysis of the situation. To be fair, since I'm the one maybe driving this, I was kind of just salvaging this problem because I thought it was interesting. But I mean, to be honest, I came at this from the whole extensible introspection thing, which was just somewhere else completely. So I mean, I'm willing to pursue both, just sort of to keep things going. But I can't hide my bias in the first path that you mentioned.
Totally. Yep. I'm not suggesting that you have to follow both, just suggesting that this is our two potential paths I could see this taking, each with their own set of trade-offs. But ultimately, you're the champion, and you should decide which path is warrant of being sketched out further.
Sure. Sounds fair.
Any other thoughts on this problem?
I would suggest action item to for Mikhail and anybody else who actually implement this feature to document it inside inside PR, so we keep like a discussion history inside an issue. So it's working.
Sure, I can do.
Sounds good. I'll leave you guys to get in touch with Victor and assemble that. Cool.
Great. Thanks.
All right, moving on, last agenda item. Benji.
Hey, okay, cool. So last agenda item is we've been working hard on GraphQL. As I said, last spec working group, it's primarily Ricky is doing a lot of code and pushing the code base forward at an incredible pace, really, for someone doing it in their spare time. And there's a few of the rest of us who are trying to keep up with reviewing pull requests and trying to stay on top of the issues as well. Obviously, it's a widely used project, so it does get quite a lot of issues and pull requests. We are struggling to keep up as a group, all of us. We have been bringing on other maintainers, but it seems that what we want to do, and the reason that we spawned off the graphical working group from the GraphQL spec working group is to enable this greater functionality that should be beneficial to basically all of the different GraphQL IDEs in the ecosystem. So things like Playground and Altair, things like VS Code extensions, language server stuff, so integrations with your editors like Vim and whatnot as well, whole load of stuff that can be enhanced by our system, and we want to make it extensible so that all these different tools can use it without necessarily having to sort of fork an old version and then struggle to keep it up to date. It's better to have like a shared core and then to implement the innovations on top of that. So that's what we want to enable, but we are struggling in terms of human resources to actually be able to do that. So I've been speaking with Chris from the Linux Foundation / GraphQL Foundation, and he's proposed that effectively the Linux Foundation have their own crowdfunding platform at funding.communitybridge.org, and there's a GraphQL project on there. They're suggesting that if companies and people, whatever, were to contribute to that project on their funding site, that could then be distributed to the maintainers in order to free up some time from client work or regular work to enable us to spend some more time maintaining the project. So I just wanted to raise that this is something that's going on, and we'd very much appreciate if anyone wanted to contribute to that, particularly the companies that are using GraphQL, and if anyone has any questions.
Benji, are you thinking of from the current set of maintainers, just like making sure that, like, setting up official contracts so that they spend dedicated time on GraphQL, or are you thinking of trying to attract contractors, new people to help that we would pay?
I think it would be more along the lines of what's the other site? Open Collective, that style of thing, where effectively there is a pool, and then the group can agree to spend money from the pool on funding someone to do a thing. It may well be that there are regular contributions going out from that. So, for example, if one of us were to stay on top of issues for a few hours a week, it might be that there's a regular payout for that. It might be that if we want to fund a particularly large task, like converting the entire system to TypeScript, for example, then that might be a chunk that we can effectively fund to them as a one-off thing. I don't think it necessarily has to be limited to the maintainers, so it could be external developers as well and contributors. But I think that's more of a thing for the Linux Foundation, GraphQL Foundation to govern over. I'm just keen that the maintainers that we have could be given some resources in order to be able to put more time into this project.
Okay, so Open Collective works more like a bounty program, right? Where you can pay out based on specific work being done, regardless of who does that.
Yeah, I think you can also do regular stuff from it, but I'm not super knowledgeable on it, so I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't actually used Open Collective in depth. Cool. Well, one thing actually I might ask of you, Benji, is to we can take this into a separate discussion, just so we don't have to burn everybody's time, and dig in deeply about the various paths and kind of like what we think tactically will be most valuable to the graphical project. In terms of just like getting funds available, that I think shouldn't be that hard. We have a pool of GraphQL Foundation funds that are specifically intended to go towards maintainers of GraphQL Foundation projects, of which Graphical is one. So that we already have set up. It's just a matter of figuring out how exactly we'd like to divvy it out. So how about you and I chat offline, and we could figure out some more specific details of how we want that to work out.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think also encouraging other people to contribute as well will help. But yeah, certainly, you know, anything that helps us spend more time on the project is a win in my book. So yeah, let's continue the conversation offline.
Sounds great. I think something that is actually pretty valuable for this group is coming up with some either easier way to contribute to those or easier ways to take from those. Right now, the one that the Linux Foundation has set up for us is pretty coarse. So I'd love to make it easier for people to contribute into those pools. So if anybody ever has ideas on how to do that, even if it's just setting up Open Collective, or I don't know, we might experiment with the GitHub sponsorship as well. The accounting of how all these things connect to each other might be tricky, but if we can make them work, I think that'd be pretty interesting to do.
I think we can reach out, at least like investigate if there is any other foundations having this set up under Linux Foundation, maybe like, I don't know, like Kubernetes Foundation or other foundations doing Open Collective or other crowdfunding, and we can just reuse the experience. So it's just something to ask from Chris and the Linux Foundation guys.
Yeah, I know that the JS Foundation has some specific stuff set up too, because the JS Foundation operates as sort of a collective of a lot of projects. And so I'll ask what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
There might be something interesting that we can try.
Yeah, because like in a sense, like we started graphical team, and like there is a lot of progress and a lot of like distribution, and team is growing. So I think like effectively right now we're like kind of like 3 projects: reference, implementation, graphical, and spec. So I'm actually think it makes sense maybe to set up something separate specifically for graphical.
That might be the case, yeah. But I'm sure we can get something working. Cool. Any other thoughts on this one? All right. Does anybody have any other things that they'd like to talk about today?
I'd like to actually. Victor, you mentioned previously about, is Victor still on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Cool. You mentioned previously about the schema, I forget what we call it, but like a schema enhancements, effectively the ability to customize the introspection of the schema so that it can pass through additional data. Do we have anyone who's specifically championing this right now? I know you were working towards it, and that's where the empty object stuff came from, but I haven't seen much talk about it recently.
Speaking for myself, I wouldn't say I'm championing it any more than, well, that comment I made specifically. When I made that comment, I had not seen, so what I saw was that Ivan, I think, made a presentation about something similar in May, and I just hadn't seen that, but it was very similar, I think, to that. But speaking for myself, I have not done anything more in that area specifically.
So a situation like that, we discuss two-stage introspection and we agree on two-stage introspection. I have some like proof of concepts and I need to add them. Like it's actually like #1 issue on my list because it's kind of working, adding repeatable directives because we will extend introspection. And it's, in a sense, it's also blocking described by, because like we also will add new field into introspection. So it's #1 on my list. But I don't want to accelerate like stuff. I think first we need to add two-stage introspection and see how it's adopted. And only when we should discuss like adding extensions to use like two-stage introspection. I don't think we should put like carriage before a horse. We should not discuss like ways to how to additionally use two-stage introspection until we actually like be sure that it's working and it's implemented and a community switching to it. So when we can have RFC and discussion for adding extension type. It can be empty, it can be, we can have some field in it, or we can figure out some way or saying like extensions are optional. So if you have something inside, this type exists. If we don't have something inside, it's not exist. I'm just saying it should not be, it's not a use case for empty types because like, it's depend on something that is not yet implemented, it's not yet adopted, so it's not a valuable use case. But I'm champion two-stage introspection and I'm working on it at the moment.
But Ivan, with two-phase introspection, you mean the asking for what features you have on the GraphQL server and then doing the actual introspection, no?
Yeah, so asking what fields you have. So in that presentation, I gave presentation about two-stage introspection. And I will, like first one is to ask what fields are existing on introspection types. And in the end of this presentation, I have like motivation slide saying we can reuse the same mechanism for adding extensions, types and extension field to every introspection object. But it's like something in future after we like, and we have consensus on two-stage introspection. It's just like, it's my personal action item to implement it. And
we actually use it in all our tools now, because we had the problem also with schema stitching, that there were different kinds of GraphQL servers that we had to stitch in, and they had different kinds of versions, so different features, and it works really good. So
okay, so it would be actually, I would ask you for links to RFC or implementation, because I can borrow some ideas for reference implementation. It will make my life easier.
We are basically doing the first introspection, then we are building the actual introspection.
I think we can take it offline because last items and we're preventing everybody.
Yeah, sorry.
So like Benji, did we answer your question, or like me and Victor?
So it seems like no one is working concretely on schema extensions, on the introspection extensions right now. It's more of the two-stage is something that you're working on, which may enable us to do that. I'm still interested to push, well, to be honest, I'd be interested to see how you think the two-stage introspection will enable the schema extensions thing as well. So maybe I can talk with you again offline about something like this.
I think we can be working on both of those in parallel as well. Super excited that, Michael, you've already gone and built the two-phase so that hopefully Yvonne can pick up from where you left off, and we can get to something that we can share beyond just the chili cream tools. But Benji, you should certainly feel free to pick up that stuff if you're excited to champion it. I don't think anybody is. I mean, you can start investigating what the impacts of that will look like in parallel.
Yeah, cool. I probably don't have enough time right now, but at some point, definitely.
Yeah.
Another like small thing, Chris reached to me and asked if I want to write a blog post after every working group about what we discussed. So I will try to create a draft, and I will probably create an issue on a repo for like with a link to draft. So if anybody wants to help with that or like review it, because obviously I'm not a native speaker, it would be greatly appreciated. I will try to do that in like next week. So have something like not as exact as notes, but like but for people to know what we're discussing and what was the results of working group and how progress look like.
Sounds great. I like that idea. All right. Anyone else have anything you want to discuss today?
I think I have the specified directive basically done. Would we want to like add GraphQL support for that too, just as like an example of like a client consuming that?
Certainly. Yeah, we can certainly make that. I don't think we would hold stage 2 for that, but that would be helpful to help move the process along. Absolutely.
Great.
Cool. Anything else? All right. We'll wrap up for the day. We've got a lot of great stuff to do next. And I'll see all of you after the winter holidays in early January.
Goodbye.
Great. See you folks.
Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.